Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your world? I speak from a century that believed order was salvation. I speak from halls of stone, banners of red, and crowds that mistook noise for truth. This is not my confession. This is my autopsy. Before the man, before the voice, before the banners and the crowds, there was a world already losing its balance. History does not begin with individuals, it prepares them. At the end of the 19th century, Europe was not at peace. It was merely quiet. Empires still stood, draped in ceremony and tradition, but beneath the surface, their foundations were tired. They ruled vast territories, not through unity, but through habit. And habit weakens when belief fades. Borders existed, but identities leaked through them. Languages overlapped. Faiths coexisted without trust. Peoples lived beside one another, not together. This mattered more than anyone understood at the time, because when identity becomes uncertain, fear looks for structure. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was one of these tired giants. It stretched across Central Europe like an old tapestry, beautiful from a distance, frayed up close. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, Jews, Italians, all bound beneath a single crown that no longer spoke clearly to any of them. Loyalty was inherited, not felt. Authority was maintained, not respected. The empire survived not because it was strong, but because nothing had yet replaced it. Cities reflected this contradiction. Grand boulevards stood beside overcrowded districts. Opera houses glittered while workers struggled to eat. Intellectual salons debated philosophy. As factories swallowed childhood and health, modernity arrived unevenly. Machines advanced faster than morality, and technology raced ahead of meaning. People felt progress, but not purpose. This was an age obsessed with order and terrified of chaos. Science promised answers. Nationalism promised belonging. Ideology promised certainty. Each offered something seductive, a way to simplify the world. No, in cafes and lecture halls, thinkers argued over the future of humanity. Some believed reason would save civilization. Others believed race would define it. Social Darwinism crept quietly into public thought. The idea that struggle was natural, that domination was evidence of worth, that weakness deserved disappearance. It did not arrive wearing cruelty. It arrived wearing logic. Industrialization reshaped lives faster than values could adjust. Men left villages for factories. Women worked longer hours for lower wages. Children labored where schools should have stood. Traditional roles collapsed, but nothing stable replaced them. This instability did not produce empathy. It produced anxiety. Anxiety seeks explanation. And explanation, when simplified, becomes ideology. Religion, once the anchor of meaning, lost its central authority. Faith fractured into doubt. Ritual into habit. Without shared belief, people turned toward shared enemies. Newspapers multiplied. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Political clubs emerged overnight. Everyone had a solution. Few had patience. Democracy appeared fragile, loud, slow, divided. Authoritarianism appeared efficient, quiet, decisive, unified. The contrast mattered. The late 19th century did not create monsters. It created conditions. Conditions in which resentment could be mistaken for insight. Conditions in which obedience felt safer than freedom. Conditions in which belonging mattered more than truth. On the edges of this empire, along borders that belonged to many and satisfied no one, small towns absorbed these tensions silently. Braunau am Inn was one of them. A modest town by a river, a crossing point, a place of transit, not destination. Border towns feel history more sharply than capitals. They do not control power, they endure it. Here, life was quiet. Routine governed days. Customs officials inspected goods. Church bells marked time. The empire felt distant, authority abstract, but uncertainty lingered like fog. Families clung to structure as a defense against instability. Rules mattered. Discipline mattered, especially to those who had climbed through obedience. One such man was Alois Hitler. He was not born into privilege. He built his status through the system, through compliance, through hierarchy. The state had given him identity. In return, he believed in it absolutely. At home, this belief became law. Authority inside the household was unquestioned. Affection was conditional. Respect was demanded, not earned. Order replaced warmth. The world beyond the household offered no correction. Schools mirrored discipline. Church reinforced obedience. Society rewarded conformity. For children growing within this framework, individuality was not nurtured. It was tolerated. Sometimes. This environment did not create cruelty. It normalized control. At the same time, loss hovered constantly over families. Infant mortality was common. Illness arrived without warning. Death was familiar. Grief was expected to be endured quietly. There was little space for emotional repair. In such a world, children learned early that survival mattered more than understanding. As the century turned, the empire continued to strain. Nationalist movements grew louder. Economic inequalities sharpened. Political language hardened. People spoke more often of us and them, not violently yet, but insistently. It is important to understand this clearly. The era did not demand destruction. It demanded explanation. And explanations, once accepted, shape perception long before they shape action. The man at the center of this story did not emerge from nothing. He emerged from a time that struggled to answer a simple question: who belongs and why? And in that unanswered question, history prepared its next figure. In a border town, life is measured in small repetitions. The same river, the same bridges, the same carts rolling over cobblestones, the same inspection stamps pressed into paper with official certainty. Braunau am Inn did not feel like the heart of an empire. It felt like a quiet hinge, a place where goods crossed, where people passed through, and where the state's presence was most visible in its smallest rituals. A uniform at a checkpoint, a ledger on a desk, a man who believed that order mattered because order was all he had. Alois Hitler belonged to that world of ledgers and rules. He was not a man of poetry. He was a man of procedure. His life had been shaped by the state in a very specific way. It had given him a ladder, and he had climbed it with stubborn determination. He had earned respect through obedience, and he guarded that respect fiercely, as if it could be taken away at any moment. People like Alois often carry an invisible fear that without structure they will fall back into insignificance. So they build structure everywhere, especially at home. The home itself was not grand. Rooms were practical, furniture chosen for use, not beauty. Air that smelled of cooked meals, ink, worn fabric, and seasonal dampness. Nothing in the household suggested destiny. Nothing suggested greatness. It suggested constraint. Clara Hitler softened the edges of that constraint. She moved through the same rooms with a different energy, quiet, attentive, protective. Where Alois demanded, she soothed. Where he corrected, she shielded. Her affection was not theoretical. It was physical, a hand on a shoulder, a bowl set down gently, a gaze that lingered, as if to say, "You are safe with me." And perhaps that safety mattered too much. Because safety, when it becomes the only source of warmth, can create dependence rather than resilience. Their family life had already been shaped by loss. In that era, death was not rare. It was familiar. Clara had endured pregnancies that did not end with living children. She carried grief like a quiet companion, and the grief made her love more intensely, as if love could protect what the world could not. In such a household, children were not simply children. They were fragile chances. Adolf Hitler was born into this atmosphere, not as a symbol, but as a boy, a child in a small town, in a tired empire, under a strict father, and beside a mother who offered a kind of warmth that could become a shelter. As he grew, the early portrait was unremarkable, not brilliant, not charismatic. A boy who could be stubborn, a boy who resisted being shaped. Where other children learned to bend, he learned to push back, not openly, not courageously, but with a quiet refusal that settled into habits. Refusal to follow instructions when they felt meaningless. Refusal to accept that authority was automatically right. These are small things in childhood. But small things, repeated, become patterns. Alois noticed. And Alois did not interpret stubbornness as personality. He interpreted it as disrespect. At the table, correction was immediate. In the tone of voice, in the narrowed eyes, in the insistence that there would be no negotiation. The father did not argue. He imposed. And when a child grows under imposed authority, the child learns a complicated lesson. Obedience can be performed without being believed. So the boy learned to split himself. Outward compliance, when necessary. Inward resistance, always. That kind of splitting can create intelligence, but it can also create emptiness. A sense that the self is only real in private, and that the world is a stage for survival. School did not rescue him from this pattern. Teachers expected discipline. The classroom demanded conformity. He did not flourish, not because he could not learn, but because he did not accept the terms. He performed well in subjects that allowed him to control the outcome, drawing especially, and anything that could be approached as structure. He struggled in areas that required patient submission. He wanted quick recognition, not slow apprenticeship. The boy was drawn to buildings and grand shapes. Architecture appealed to him because it obeyed. Lines stayed where you put them. Walls rose when you designed them. Stones did not contradict you. A building could be imagined in full before it existed. And in that imagining, there was a kind of power. It was not power over people, not yet. It was power over form. Music also held him, at times. Church services, with their ritual and echoes, offered an atmosphere where emotion was contained within order. Candles, voices, and the structured repetition of hymns made the world seem coherent. For someone living in a household of tension, ritual can feel like peace. But peace did not last. When Adolf was 11, his younger brother Edmund died. The loss was ordinary in that era. One more tragedy among many. But inside the family, it was not ordinary. It changed the air of the house. Clara's protection became more intense. Alois's anger became more rigid, as if grief had hardened his need for control. And Adolf, in the quiet aftermath, became more inward. The death did not create ideology. It created a texture of feeling, absence, uncertainty, and a sense that what is loved can vanish without warning. Children respond to loss in many ways. Some become tender, some become careful, some become numb. In Adolf's case, the world became colder, not in temperature, in meaning. He learned, without language, that the world takes things away. And when the world takes things away, some people do not grieve. They accuse. Alois wanted his son to become a civil servant, not for the son's joy, for the family's continuity. A respectable job, a stable ladder, an identity defined by the state. For Alois, that identity had worked. He could not understand why his son resisted it. Resistance looked like ingratitude. And for the boy, the father's insistence felt like a prison, not a physical one, a conceptual one, a future that would close doors, silence imagination, reduce life to routine. He did not yet know how to articulate this, but he knew how to sabotage. He performed poorly in school at times, not purely from inability, but from refusal. A childish tactic, yes, but tactics in childhood can become strategies in adulthood when they are rewarded or left uncorrected. In January 1903, Alois died suddenly. The house changed overnight. The authority that had dominated the rooms was gone. Grief did not arrive with softness. It arrived with emptiness, and a kind of release that did not feel noble, but felt real. For Clara, it was devastation. For the children, it was confusion. For Adolf, it was complicated. He had lost an enemy and a structure at the same time. With Alois gone, discipline loosened. Clara tried to hold the household together, but she was not a force of control. She was a force of care. And care, without structure, cannot always guide ambition. Adolf left school early. He drifted between vague plans and persistent dreams. The dream he held on to was art. Not art as practice, art as identity. He imagined himself recognized, admired, elevated, as if recognition could correct everything that felt wrong inside him. Around him, the empire continued to strain. People spoke more openly about nationalism, about purity, about belonging. In small towns and large cities alike, a nervous question began to rise. Who are we really, and who is not? The boy did not yet have an answer, but he was growing into a world that would offer answers cheaply. By 1907, Clara's health began to fail. The illness was slow and brutal in its quietness. A household that had survived strict authority now faced something that could not be commanded. Disease does not obey hierarchy. It does not care about discipline. It simply takes. Adolf, now a teenager, was devoted to his mother. Her affection had been his refuge. Her belief in him had been his soft shelter. As she weakened, the foundation of his emotional world began to crumble. And so, in the same year her body began to fail, he left for Vienna, not as a hardened ideologue, not as a figure of history, as a young man carrying two things: a fragile dream of greatness and an inner world already crowded with absence. Vienna awaited him, not as salvation, as a mirror, and the mirror would be unforgiving. Vienna did not announce itself gently. It rose before him as a city of surfaces, stone facades polished by empire, avenues designed to impress rather than welcome, institutions that spoke in the language of achievement and exclusion. To arrive in Vienna was to arrive before witnesses. The city watched. He arrived with modest belongings and an expectation that felt older than his years. The expectation was not practical, it was emotional. Vienna, he believed, would recognize him, not because he had earned recognition, but because recognition felt overdue. This distinction mattered more than he understood. The Academy of Fine Arts stood like a gatekeeper, quiet, formal, unimpressed. Its walls did not care about ambition. They responded only to evidence. When he submitted his work, the act itself felt ceremonial, as if destiny were finally being asked to reveal itself. The evaluation was brief, impersonal. The answer was no. Rejection did not arrive with cruelty. It arrived with indifference. No explanation that felt personal, no conversation that invited growth. Just a decision. And for someone whose inner life had already learned to interpret loss as judgment, indifference cut deeper than insult. He applied again. Because dreams, when threatened, do not retreat quietly. They double down. The second rejection followed the first. With the same quiet finality, the Academy suggested architecture. It was meant as guidance. It landed as dismissal. Architecture required credentials he did not possess. Credentials required discipline he had never accepted. The door closed without drama. Vienna did not argue with him. It simply moved on. The city had no obligation to wait. At the same time, the world he had left behind was dissolving. His mother's illness worsened. Letters carried bad news slowly, as if distance could soften reality. But reality did not soften. When Clara Hitler died in December 1907, the loss was not abstract. It was final. The emotional center of his life vanished. The one figure who had offered unconditional protection, who had believed in him without demand, was gone. And grief, in the absence of support, does not always express itself as sorrow. Sometimes it expresses itself as resentment. He returned briefly for the funeral. The town had not changed. The routines continued. Death was absorbed quietly, as it always was. There was no moment of transformation waiting for him there. So he returned to Vienna. Alone, money became an immediate problem. The inheritance was small. It vanished quickly. Housing shifted from rented rooms to shared spaces to shelters. The city that glittered from afar offered little warmth up close. Poverty has its own rhythm. Days become about survival. Nights about endurance. Meals are counted. Conversations shrink. The future narrows into the next morning. He sold paintings when he could. They were precise, almost architectural. Buildings, streets, landmarks. They lacked people. They lacked emotion. They were accurate and empty. Buyers did not care about intention. They cared about price. Vienna surrounded him with contrasts. Opera houses glowed at night, their entrances alive with movement and confidence. Cafes buzzed with discussion. Ideas traded like currency. Men spoke with certainty about politics, about culture, about decline and renewal. He listened, and listening without belonging can sharpen distance into judgment. The city was multicultural, but not harmonious. Different communities existed side by side, often without trust. Political rhetoric fed on this separation. Pamphlets circulated freely. Cheap, repetitive, confident, they offered narratives. They named causes. They named culprits. They simplified. This was not indoctrination in the dramatic sense. It was saturation. Ideas repeated often enough lose their edges. They become background. And background shapes perception quietly. He did not immediately adopt hatred as identity. That would come later. What he absorbed first was explanation. Why success belonged to others. Why institutions rejected him. Why the city felt closed. Explanations that removed personal responsibility are always tempting to the humiliated. Loneliness deepened. He withdrew further. Social relationships did not form easily. There was no community to correct his assumptions, no mentor to redirect ambition, no structure to force reflection. Isolation became normal, and isolation distorts. Vienna also offered beauty. Music, especially, overwhelmed him. Wagner's operas, with their mythic scale and moral certainty, offered a universe where struggle was meaningful and victory was justified. Here, complexity disappeared. Heroes were pure. Enemies were clear. Destiny was loud. For someone drowning in ambiguity, this clarity felt like truth. Art ceased to be exploration. It became validation. The world, he began to believe, should reflect the structure of art, ordered, hierarchical, unified, not debated. By the time his inheritance was gone, his inner narrative had shifted. Failure was no longer a stage. It was evidence. Evidence that the system was flawed. Evidence that talent was ignored. Evidence that belonging was restricted. The city did not correct him. It had no interest in doing so. When he finally left Vienna in 1913, it was not with closure. It was with anger, anger without language, anger without target, but anger nonetheless. Munich appeared different. German, orderly, more confident. Here, he believed, the future might still be negotiated. Vienna became, in his memory, a symbol of humiliation, of pluralism, of rejection. Symbols, once formed, do not fade easily. What he carried with him was not yet ideology. It was preparation, a mind trained to interpret failure as injustice, a temperament shaped by authority without empathy, a longing for belonging strong enough to accept dangerous explanations. The world was moving toward war. He did not yet know it, but the next structure would be offered soon, and this time he would step into it willingly. He did not arrive in Munich as a man formed. He arrived as a shape without weight. The city received him without ceremony. It did not test him as Vienna had. It simply existed, orderly, confident, assured of itself. For someone exhausted by rejection, that assurance felt like relief. Munich, before the war, was quieter than Vienna, but firmer in identity. It knew what it was. It did not apologize for it. German language dominated without negotiation. Tradition felt unbroken. Hierarchy remained intact. To him, this mattered. Belonging, even imagined, can stabilize a fragile inner world. Yet inside, instability remained, because what he carried from childhood was not ambition grounded in skill, but longing untethered from reality. This longing had grown slowly, fed by contradiction. A father who demanded obedience, but never offered affirmation. A mother who offered protection, but could not teach independence. Between them, the child had learned neither confidence nor humility. He had learned expectation. Expectation without preparation creates tension, and tension, when unresolved, seeks release. He spent long hours alone, walking the streets, observing buildings, studying facades and monuments. He was drawn to scale. Large structures calmed him. They suggested permanence. They suggested certainty. A city that knew how to stand felt like an answer to a world that wavered. But this attraction to scale was not merely aesthetic, it was psychological. Grandeur compensates for inner smallness. Structure compensates for uncertainty. He did not yet articulate this. He only felt it. The absence of formal education became more apparent with time. Opportunities narrowed. Social circles remained distant. He did not integrate easily. He did not adapt. Adaptation requires humility, the willingness to be reshaped. He resisted reshaping. His sense of self remained suspended. He was no longer a boy, but not yet a man in the social sense. No profession, no stable role, no recognized achievement. Only the belief that recognition had been denied unfairly. This belief hardened quietly. He did not discuss it openly. He rehearsed it internally. Every observation became evidence. Every success of others, confirmation. Confirmation that the world favored someone else. Identity, when not earned, is often borrowed. He borrowed from ideas circulating around him. National pride, cultural superiority, romanticized history. These ideas offered pre-made frameworks. They required no self-examination. They did not ask, "Who am I?" They answered, "Who we are." This distinction is critical. A self formed through internal effort is resilient. A self formed through collective abstraction is brittle. In Munich, he followed political conversations loosely, not as participant, but as listener. He absorbed tone rather than substance. Certainty mattered more than content. The world beyond Germany was shifting. Diplomacy strained. Alliances tightened. Newspapers spoke more frequently of conflict. He read them obsessively. War, still distant, hovered like a possibility. He did not fear it. Fear requires something to lose. He felt that life had not yet begun. When war finally arrived in 1914, it arrived not as catastrophe, but as invitation. An invitation to disappear into something larger. But before the uniform, before the front, before the crowds and banners, There was a final, quiet stage. A man with no gravity, standing at the edge of history, waiting for something to pull him into place. And gravity would come when war finally came. It did not feel like interruption. It felt like resolution. Across Germany, streets filled with movement. Trains groaned under the weight of uniforms and equipment. Posters appeared overnight, bright with promise. Speeches echoed through public squares, their words simple, rhythmic, reassuring. The language of war was not subtle. It did not invite doubt. It offered clarity, one to school. For many, that clarity was terrifying. For him, it was relieving. The world, which had long felt vague and unstructured, suddenly presented a single direction. Forward. He volunteered immediately. There was no hesitation that came from ideology, no careful consideration of consequence, only a readiness to be absorbed. The uniform changed everything. In civilian life, his body had been unremarkable, his presence unnoticed. In uniform, he became interchangeable, and interchangeability felt like equality. Training camps replaced uncertainty with repetition. The days followed patterns. Orders were clear. Consequences immediate. For the first time, he did not have to invent meaning. Meaning was issued. The discipline was harsh, but it was impersonal. It did not judge his past. It did not question his failures. It only demanded compliance. And compliance, to someone shaped by authority, felt familiar. The front itself was less dramatic than imagined. Long stretches of waiting, the landscape scarred and grey, the air heavy with fatigue. War, in practice, was not heroic. It was monotonous. But monotony has a strange power. It quiets the inner voice. He served as a messenger, moving between positions, carrying information written by others. He did not strategize. He did not command. He executed. Responsibility without decision. Risk without reflection. Around him, men complained of exhaustion, of homesickness, of confusion. He listened, but did not share their longing. The front had given him something home never had. A role. The danger was real, but it was structured. Shells fell, but unpredictability existed within a system. Fear was collective, and collective fear is easier to bear than solitary doubt. He was wounded more than once, but not permanently. Pain passed. What remained was attachment. The war did not traumatize him in the way it traumatized others. It stabilized him. In hospitals, surrounded by injured bodies and dim light, he listened to the changing tone of conversation. Talk shifted from victory to endurance, from endurance to shortage. The certainty of early months faded, but he held on to it. When news of the armistice arrived, it felt unreal. Germany had not collapsed at the front. The soldiers had not been overwhelmed. The surrender felt abstract, disconnected. Disbelief hardened into narrative. The idea spread quickly. Defeat had come from within. The explanation mattered more than evidence. It preserved meaning. For him, this explanation aligned perfectly with everything he had already internalized. Failure was never personal. It was imposed. Returning to civilian life was not a return. It was exile. Germany had changed. The empire was gone. Authority fragmented. Debate replaced command. For someone shaped by obedience, debate felt like decay. He remained connected to the army, not out of loyalty, but necessity. The military still offered structure. In a country that no longer knew how to hold itself together, assigned to observe political groups, he entered rooms thick with frustration. Men spoke loudly. Ideas clashed. But beneath the noise, a shared feeling existed. Loss. He listened carefully, not to arguments, but to emotions. He learned which words stirred anger, which silenced doubt, which ignited recognition. When he spoke, it was not with eloquence. It was with intensity. He mirrored the room's resentment back to itself, and the room responded. This response mattered more than ideology. It confirmed something essential. He was not invisible when he spoke of grievance. From this moment, his sense of self began to shift, not because he had found truth, but because he had found effect. Effect creates identity faster than reflection. He did not yet seek power. He sought confirmation, and confirmation came from the crowd. The child without gravity had found weight, not in self-knowledge, but in reaction. The rooms were never impressive. They were rented halls, back rooms of taverns, spaces borrowed from ordinary life and filled with smoke, impatience, and unspent anger. Tables were crowded, chairs were mismatched. The air was thick with breath and grievance. And yet, something important happened there, not because of the ideas themselves, but because of what the ideas did. He attended at first as an observer, assigned by the military to listen, to report, to assess. It was meant to be administrative, but listening is never neutral. Listening changes the listener. He noticed patterns, not in arguments, but in reactions. Certain words tightened faces. Certain phrases produced nods. Certain accusations ignited recognition. He learned that people did not want explanations. That complicated their suffering. They wanted explanations. That honored it. The meetings were chaotic. Different factions competed for attention. Nationalists, socialists, conservatives, radicals of every kind. Most speakers drowned in their own noise. They argued as if argument itself were virtue. He did not admire them. He studied them. One evening, a discussion drifted toward identity. What was Germany now? Who had betrayed it? Someone suggested separation, a retreat into smaller loyalties. The idea disturbed him. Fragmentation had always felt like threat. He spoke, not with preparation, not with eloquence, but with force. The words came quickly, as if they had been waiting. He rejected fragmentation, condemned weakness, named betrayal without defining it too clearly. His voice rose and fell instinctively. He did not persuade with evidence. He compelled with certainty. The room changed, not dramatically, subtly. Attention shifted. Silence gathered. He felt it immediately. The sensation was unmistakable. The crowd had turned toward him. This moment did not create belief. It created confirmation. Confirmation that his inner narrative could live outside his own mind. Afterward, people approached him, invited him to return, asked him to speak again. The validation did not come from achievement. It came from effect. He joined the party soon after. It was small, insignificant. The German Workers' Party, a name that promised belonging, without clarity. That ambiguity was useful. He did not enter as leader. He entered as voice. And voice he would learn, is often more powerful than position. He began to speak regularly, not to inform, to organize feeling. He refined tone, not content. Repetition mattered. Rhythm mattered. Simplicity mattered. He learned to pace his words as if they were music, to pause where anticipation built, to accelerate where anger gathered. Volume was not constant. It was strategic. He watched the crowd. As much as he spoke to it, faces revealed more than applause. He adjusted accordingly. Complexity disappeared from his language, not because he could not understand it, but because it diluted effect. The world was reduced to contrasts: strong and weak, loyal and traitorous, pure and corrupted. These categories required no nuance. They demanded alignment. Alignment felt like relief to the crowd and to him. He began to understand something essential. Belonging is more powerful than truth. People will defend what makes them feel whole, even when it costs them reality. As his presence grew, the party reshaped itself around him. Symbols were refined, colors chosen for visibility, forms simplified for recognition. Order was imposed visually before it was imposed politically. Uniformity calmed the anxious. It suggested discipline where chaos reigned. He spoke increasingly of destiny, not mystical destiny, national destiny, a story larger than individual failure, a narrative in which suffering was meaningful. The child, without gravity, had found an external center, not in self-knowledge, but in reaction. Power was still distant, but influence was real, and influence reshapes the self. He did not ask whether the ideas were correct. He asked whether they worked, and they did. Each gathering reinforced the pattern. He spoke. They responded. The response fed conviction. Conviction sharpened delivery. This feedback loop replaced reflection. He no longer needed to examine himself. The crowd did that for him. At this stage, the ideology was still fluid. Hatred existed, but it was not yet systematized. Enemies were named broadly. Solutions remained abstract. Abstraction protected him. It allowed denial later. He was learning patience, learning that power does not need to arrive violently. It can arrive gradually, legally, invited. The party grew, slowly, quietly, enough to be noticed, not enough to be feared. He waited, and waiting no longer felt empty. It felt strategic. The child who had once drifted now moved with purpose. But the purpose was external, borrowed, dependent. This mattered because a self built on reflection can withstand contradiction. A self built on reaction cannot. The gravity he had found was not internal. It was held by the crowd. And crowds, as history would demonstrate again and again, do not stabilize. They amplify. By the early 1920s, Germany itself was becoming unsteady again. Economic strain returned. Political trust eroded. The conditions that had shaped him were resurfacing. Only now he had a voice. The stage was set, not for greatness, for consequence. By the early 1920s, Germany no longer felt defeated. It felt wounded. The war had ended, but its presence lingered everywhere. In empty factories, in men standing too long on street corners, in conversations that returned again and again to what had been lost. The republic that replaced the empire was young, fragile, and constantly questioned. Democracy arrived not as celebration, but as argument. For many, argument felt like weakness. Inflation crept quietly at first, then it accelerated. Money lost meaning. Savings dissolved into paper. A lifetime of discipline could vanish in weeks. People who had trusted order found themselves exposed, and exposure breeds anger. In this environment, voices that promised certainty grew louder, not because they offered solutions, but because they offered direction. He watched the crisis closely, not as economist, not as strategist, as interpreter. The party remained small, but its message sharpened. He adjusted language to fit the moment. Economic pain became moral injury. Political disagreement became betrayal. He spoke less about policy and more about restoration. Restoration is a powerful word. It suggests return without loss, repair without sacrifice. It promises a past that never truly existed. Crowds responded, not with trust, but with relief. Relief that someone was speaking with certainty. When institutions hesitated, the illusion began to take shape. That the time for words was ending, that action was required, that history was waiting. He believed it. Belief, when reinforced by applause, feels indistinguishable from insight. In Bavaria, nationalist groups grew restless. They admired examples abroad, decisive figures who acted quickly, who bypassed debate, who imposed order. The idea of decisive action began to circulate as necessity rather than risk. He absorbed these ideas eagerly, not critically. He had never been trained to measure consequences, only to measure reaction. In November 1923, the moment arrived, or appeared to. A political gathering filled a large beer hall in Munich. Speeches were underway. The atmosphere was charged, but disorganized. He entered with confidence, borrowed from momentum rather than preparation. He interrupted the meeting, declared that a national revolution had begun, declared that the existing government was finished, declared himself aligned with forces greater than the room. The words were dramatic. The plan was not. Support that had been promised quietly evaporated publicly. Institutions did not collapse. Authorities did not hesitate. The illusion of inevitability shattered almost immediately. What followed was not a turning point. It was confusion. The attempt failed quickly, not through confrontation, but through exposure. Exposure of disorganization. Exposure of overconfidence. Exposure of a dream that could not yet carry weight. He fled briefly, hid. The energy that had fueled speeches drained into uncertainty. For the first time in years, the echo fell silent. Arrest followed, not as tragedy, not as martyrdom, as procedure. The trial that followed revealed something unexpected. The system treated him gently. Judges listened patiently. The tone was sympathetic. He was not framed as threat. He was framed as misguided. This mattered deeply, because it confirmed something dangerous, that the system he despised did not yet understand him. In court, he spoke again, not defensively, performatively. He reframed failure as intention, defeat as sacrifice. He spoke not to judges, but to a public hungry for clarity. The sentence was lenient, prison, but not disgrace. Inside confinement, urgency dissolved, time slowed, noise disappeared, and in silence he began to reorganize his story. He did not reflect on error, he rewrote meaning. Failure became proof. That action had been premature, not wrong. The lesson was not restraint, it was patience. He dictated his ideas, not carefully, not rigorously, with certainty. The book he produced was not a program, it was a declaration. It divided the world into forces. It simplified history into narrative. It replaced ambiguity with destiny. Most people ignored it. That did not matter. It mattered that he believed it. When he left prison, Germany had stabilized temporarily. The crisis receded. Public attention shifted elsewhere. His movement shrank. This did not discourage him. It confirmed his revised strategy. Power would not be seized. It would be accepted. He rebuilt slowly, organized quietly, refined message, reduced spectacle. The dream had not died. It had matured. The illusion of action had failed, but the illusion of destiny had hardened. And destiny, once believed, does not require urgency. It requires opportunity. And opportunity, history would soon provide. Prison did not feel like punishment to him. It felt like suspension. The walls were solid, the routines predictable. The noise of the outside world softened into distance. For the first time in years, nothing demanded reaction. And in the absence of reaction, he began to arrange his thoughts. He was not isolated in the way criminals often are. Visitors were allowed. Supporters wrote letters. Sympathy circulated quietly. The failed action had not destroyed his image. It had altered it. From agitator to misunderstood patriot, this transformation mattered because it removed urgency. Urgency had always pushed him towards spectacle. Silence now invited construction. Within the prison, he spoke constantly to fellow inmates, to attendants, to anyone who listened. He did not question himself. He narrated himself. Narration is not reflection. Reflection examines error. Narration organizes belief. He chose the latter. He began to dictate a book, not carefully researched, not cautiously framed, but assertive, declarative. The tone was not exploratory, it was final. The writing did not emerge from study, it emerged from conviction. He described the world as if its structure were already proven. History was simplified into cause and effect. Complex events reduced to intention. Groups were defined by function rather than humanity. The most dangerous aspect was not hostility, it was coherence. The book provided him something he had lacked, a system. Within this system, nothing happened by accident. Failure was reinterpreted as obstruction, opposition as sabotage. The self was purified. Responsibility displaced outward. He wrote himself into inevitability. This is important because people do not follow plans. They follow stories. And the story he constructed placed him at the center of historical necessity. The world, as he described it, was in decline, not because of complexity, but because of contamination, not because of change, but because of deviation. Order was the solution, uniformity the cure. The language was absolute. There was no room for doubt. Doubt weakens systems. Certainty fortifies them. In prison, there was no audience to challenge him, no opposition to test ideas. The narrative hardened uninterrupted. When the book was finished, its reception was modest. Sales were limited. Public attention faint. This did not disturb him. He did not write to persuade the present. He wrote to instruct the future. Prison also taught him something else. Violence was inefficient. It revealed intention too early. It provoked resistance. The failed attempt had shown him the limits of force. The lesson he drew was not moral. It was strategic. Power, he concluded, must be approached gradually, wrapped in legality, disguised as restoration, invited. When he was released, Germany was quieter. The economy had stabilized. The Republic appeared to function. The crisis that had fueled extremism had temporarily receded. His movement was weaker. Membership declined. Meetings shrank. Newspapers lost interest. This, too, did not disturb him. He had learned patience. Patience had replaced urgency as his guiding principle. He reorganized. The party was rebuilt from the inside. Hierarchy clarified. Discipline enforced. Personal loyalty emphasized. Symbols were standardized. Uniformity expanded. Visual order preceded political order. He spoke less, but when he spoke with restraint. Emotion was still present, but controlled. He did not chase the crowd. He waited for it. Waiting is not passive. When belief has hardened into destiny, waiting becomes preparation. Years passed. He watched governments rise and fall, coalitions form and collapse. Democracy exhaust itself through endless negotiation. He did not intervene. Intervention would expose him. Instead, he allowed frustration to accumulate. The dream that could not carry weight in action now carried weight in structure. The failure had not ended him. It had refined him, and somewhere beneath the calm surface of the Republic, new tensions were forming. Economic stability was fragile. Trust was thin. Confidence borrowed. The conditions that had once lifted him were returning. Only now he was ready. When he returned to the world outside the prison walls, Germany no longer burned. It merely smoldered. The chaos that had once filled the streets had retreated into offices, committees, and temporary agreements. The Republic appeared calmer, not stronger, just quieter. For many, this calm was relief. For him, it was opportunity delayed. He stepped back into a political landscape that no longer needed shouting. Extremism had fallen out of fashion. Stability, however fragile, was admired. The movement he had helped ignite had shrunk into the margins. Its meetings were smaller. Its influence diminished. He did not panic. He had learned that visibility was not always power. Instead of chasing attention, he reorganized, quietly, methodically. The party transformed from a loud gathering into a disciplined structure. Membership was scrutinized, hierarchy clarified, personal loyalty emphasized above all else. Disagreement was framed as weakness, unity as virtue. These lessons had been learned early, first in the household of authority, then in the army, and finally in the failure of premature action. Symbols became essential. They offered identity without explanation. A shared visual language replaced shared reasoning. Uniformity created belonging. And belonging, once granted, could be leveraged. He traveled across Germany, speaking not to overwhelm, but to remind. He did not promise revolution. He promised restoration. Restoration implied patience. It allowed supporters to wait without doubt. It framed delay as necessity. The Republic continued its careful balancing act. Coalitions formed. Coalitions collapsed. Each compromise weakened faith. Democracy did not fail dramatically. It exhausted itself quietly. Years passed, and with them, confidence thinned. In 1929, the illusion of stability shattered. Economic collapse arrived not as rumor, but as fact. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment spread like a slow tide. Families who had believed themselves secure found their foundations gone. The crisis did not ask permission. It returned fear to daily life. Fear reshapes perception. It narrows thought. It accelerates blame. People do not ask complex questions. When survival feels threatened, they look for voices that sound certain. He was ready. The language shifted again. Economic pain became national humiliation. Unemployment became evidence of betrayal. Complex systems were reduced to moral failure. Crowds grew, not because they admired him, because they needed something solid to hold on to. He positioned himself carefully, not as destroyer of the Republic, as its inevitable successor. Legality became camouflage. Elections became instruments. He did not storm institutions. He entered them. Support widened, not from conviction alone, but from desperation. Those who did not believe in him believed in stability. And stability, he promised, would return under his guidance. Opposition fractured. Some underestimated him. Others believed they could control him. Many believed the crisis would pass before he could matter. They misread patience. The movement no longer depended on spectacle. It depended on structure. It no longer demanded immediate loyalty. It offered gradual alignment. Each gain felt temporary. Each concession felt manageable, until concessions accumulated into transformation. By the early 1932, he no longer stood at the margins. He stood waiting at the threshold of power. The dreams that had once collapsed under their own weight had been rebuilt, not lighter, heavier, supported by fear, by exhaustion, by the quiet erosion of trust. The illusion was no longer action, it was inevitability. And when inevitability is believed, resistance feels pointless. The man who had once mistaken noise for readiness now mistook silence for consent. History was about to test that assumption. Power did not arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly, wrapped in procedure, escorted by legality, and welcomed by those who believed they could manage it. This is how it almost always comes. Germany, in the early 1932, was exhausted, not defeated in spirit, worn down in patience. Years of instability had hollowed out trust. Coalitions had risen and fallen. Promises had been made and revised, until language itself felt unreliable. People no longer expected improvement. They expected relief. In this environment, certainty became valuable currency. Not certainty of success, certainty of direction. And he offered that. He did not present himself as a revolutionary. He presented himself as inevitable. Elections became steps, not tests. Each campaign refined the message. less rage, more reassurance, less spectacle, more order. He spoke of unity, not diversity, not debate. Unity as discipline, unity as cure. The promise was simple. Germany would stand again. Institutions would function. Chaos would end. The cost was not discussed. Those who believed they could restrain him focused on his usefulness. They believed he could stabilize crowds, contain extremism, absorb anger. They believed power would tame him. They misunderstood its function. In January 1933, he was appointed Chancellor, not by force, not by revolution, by signature. The moment did not feel final. It felt procedural, another attempt at balance, by men who had lost the ability to see long consequences. From the outside, little changed at first. Cabinet meetings continued. Bureaucracy functioned. The Constitution remained. But power does not need to destroy structures immediately. It only needs to occupy them. He moved quickly, but not loudly. Emergency measures were introduced. Security was emphasized. Threats were named. Each measure framed as temporary. Temporary measures are the most permanent. Fear was cultivated carefully, not constant panic, controlled anxiety, enough to justify expansion of authority, not enough to provoke resistance. Institutions adapted. Some cooperated willingly, others complied reluctantly. Few resisted openly. Resistance requires clarity. Clarity was deliberately blurred. Laws were passed that transferred responsibility upward, decision-making centralized, accountability diffused. He did not abolish democracy. He hollowed it out. Opposition voices found themselves isolated, not arrested at first, not silenced dramatically, marginalized, discredited, removed from relevance. Language shifted subtly. Criticism became disloyalty. Doubt became weakness. Loyalty became virtue. The public adjusted. Adjustment happens faster than anyone expects, especially when adjustment feels like survival. Uniforms reappeared in daily life, not as threat, as reassurance. Order made visible. Parades returned. Symbols multiplied. They filled the emotional space left by trust. He understood something fundamental. People do not need to love authority to accept it. They only need to believe it is necessary. The machinery of the state turned more smoothly now. Decisions were faster, debate shorter. Efficiency became proof of legitimacy. Those who had warned of danger were dismissed as alarmists. They had warned before. And before, catastrophe had not arrived. This time felt different. This time felt organized. He rarely spoke of himself. He spoke of Germany. The distinction mattered. Gradually, roles blurred. The state and the leader became difficult to separate. Criticism of one implied criticism of the other. He did not demand worship. It emerged naturally from relief, from repetition, from the absence of alternatives. War, in this sense, was not yet military. It was psychological, a constant framing of life. As struggle justified discipline. Discipline justified obedience. Obedience justified concentration of power. The shelter that war promised was not protection from enemies. It was protection from uncertainty. And uncertainty, for a population long exhausted, had become unbearable. He understood that well, because he Two, had spent a lifetime fleeing it. Power, once secured, seeks permanence. Not loudly, not immediately. Permanence is not built through declarations. It is built through repetition, routine, and rule. The early months after his appointment were not marked by spectacle. They were marked by paperwork. Documents moved between offices. Committees redefined authority. Regulations multiplied. The transformation did not announce itself as revolution. It announced itself as administration. He understood something crucial. Ideology, left as speech, remains fragile. Ideology, embedded in procedure, becomes durable. Ministries were reorganized. Responsibilities overlapped, not by accident, but by design. Overlapping authority creates confusion. Confusion creates dependence. Dependence concentrates power. The language of governance shifted. Words like order, security, and renewal replaced words like debate and pluralism. These were not neutral substitutions. They reframed expectations. Citizens were encouraged to think of the state, not as a forum, but as a guardian. A guardian does not consult. It protects. Protection, once accepted as the primary function of authority, justifies intrusion. Intrusion justified control. Control normalized surveillance. Surveillance did not arrive as invasion. It arrived as reassurance. If you had nothing to hide, you had nothing to fear. Institutions complied, some out of agreement, some out of caution, most out of habit. Bureaucracies adapt more easily than people realize. They follow incentives. They avoid conflict. Judicial independence narrowed quietly. Judges remained in place. Courts continued to function, but interpretation shifted. Laws were read with new priorities. Security outweighed liberty. Stability outweighed dissent. Nothing dramatic changed in a single day. That was the point. The press adjusted its tone. Outlets that aligned themselves with the new language found access easier. Those that questioned it found distribution harder. Not banned, just obstructed. Obstruction is more effective than prohibition. It avoids confrontation. It exhausts resistance. Education followed. Curricula were revised. Not rewritten entirely, refocused. History emphasized continuity and destiny. Complexity was streamlined. Young minds were not taught to analyze. They were taught to identify. Identification replaced inquiry. Belonging replaced understanding. Organizations outside the state were encouraged to align. Cultural groups, professional associations, youth organizations. Alignment was presented as patriotism. Non-alignment became suspicious. Suspicion did not require accusation. It required implication. Uniforms appeared in civilian life again. Not everywhere. Not all at once. Enough to create presence. Presence suggests inevitability. Public rituals expanded. Parades. Ceremonies. Symbols repeated until they felt familiar. Familiarity reduces resistance. He rarely intervened personally in these processes. That was deliberate. Systems work best when they appear impersonal. Authority feels stronger when it seems embedded, rather than imposed. The ideology itself simplified further. It did not invite belief through argument. It invited alignment through emotion. Unity became moral currency. Disagreement was framed not as difference, but as fracture. Fracture implied danger. The state's narrative hardened. Germany had been weakened by division. Strength required cohesion. Cohesion required discipline. This logic closed itself neatly. Those who questioned discipline were accused of threatening cohesion. Those who threatened cohesion were framed as enemies. Enemies did not need to be fully defined. Ambiguity allowed flexibility. Targets could shift as needed. This was not chaos. It was control. What made the system effective was not cruelty. It was participation. Millions adjusted their behavior, not because they were forced to, but because adaptation felt safer. Compliance does not require agreement. It requires calculation, and calculation, repeated daily, becomes habit. By the time concern surfaced, the architecture was already standing. Walls built of procedure, doors guarded by legality. Resistance now required risk. Most people avoided risk. He had not created a dictatorship overnight. He had created a framework in which opposition could no longer function. The war he offered as shelter was no longer metaphorical. It was structural, a permanent state of readiness, a society trained to accept command. The promise remained unchanged. Order would protect you. Few asked, from what? Every system of power eventually needs a boundary. Not a physical one at first, a conceptual one, a line that separates belonging from exclusion, loyalty from threat, order from chaos. The ideology did not begin with hatred. It began with simplification. The world, as it was presented, became divided into clear shapes. We were defined not by shared values, but by shared identity. They were defined not by actions, but by difference. Difference, once framed as danger, no longer required justification. Race entered the narrative not as biology, but as metaphor, a metaphor for purity, for coherence, for control. The language was deliberately vague. It spoke of contamination, of decay, of weakness, spreading unseen. These were not descriptions of people. They were abstractions. Abstractions make exclusion easier. The state did not initially demand violence. It demanded alignment. Alignment required identification. Identification required classification. Classification is where harm begins. Not through action, but through naming. Certain groups were described as incompatible, not evil, just disruptive, not enemies, just obstacles. This framing mattered. It allowed ordinary people to accept exclusion without confronting cruelty. The Jewish population occupied a central place in this constructed narrative, not because of what Jewish individuals did, but because of what they symbolized. Within a distorted worldview, they represented complexity, urban life, intellectualism, pluralism, mobility, all the things that resisted simple categorization. In a system desperate for order, complexity becomes suspicious. Historical anti-Semitism provided familiar language. Old myths were recycled. Economic anxieties repurposed. Nothing new was invented. It was reorganized. The ideology did not argue its claims rigorously. It repeated them. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity breeds acceptance. Gradually, laws followed language. Not abruptly, incrementally. Regulations redefined citizenship. Rights were differentiated. Participation became conditional. These measures were presented as administrative, not punitive. They were framed as clarification: who belonged fully, who belonged partially, who did not belong at all. Most citizens did not feel directly affected. This was crucial. Distance dulls urgency. If exclusion does not touch your daily life, it feels abstract. And abstraction anesthetizes conscience. Institutions complied. Schools adjusted curricula. Professional organizations revised membership criteria. None of this felt dramatic. It felt bureaucratic. This was not chaos imposed from above. It was order accepted from below. The simplicity of the narrative made resistance difficult. To object required defending complexity. Complexity is exhausting, especially in times of fear. The ideology offered relief. It said, the problem is not uncertainty. The problem is them. This absolved individuals from confronting structural failure. It replaced responsibility with blame. The leader himself rarely spoke in detail about implementation. That work was delegated. Delegation created distance. Distance protected image. He positioned himself as interpreter of destiny, not administrator of exclusion. This separation allowed admiration to persist, even as systems hardened. The tragedy of this phase was not that people became monsters. It was that they became functionaries. Most did not feel cruel. They felt efficient. They followed rules. They adapted. They avoided attention. And avoidance, repeated daily, became complicity. The boundary between us and them was now institutional. It existed in paperwork, in language, in habit. Once embedded, it no longer required constant reinforcement. It maintained itself. The war offered as shelter had now fully transformed. It was no longer a response to crisis. It was a permanent state of categorization. And categorization, once normalized, does not stop where it begins. It expands. Expansion did not begin as conquest. It began as correction, a promise to repair what history had, supposedly, distorted. Inside Germany, the transformation felt complete. Order had returned to daily life. Employment rose through mobilization and spectacle. Public works reshaped landscapes and morale alike. Movement itself became evidence of success. Trains ran on time. Roads stretched forward. Crowds gathered with renewed purpose. For many, this was enough. But order, once restored internally, demands an outlet. Stability without direction becomes stagnant, and stagnation threatens belief. The ideology had always implied motion, not endless negotiation; advance, not coexistence; assertion. The language of destiny does not tolerate stillness. Borders, long regarded as humiliating reminders of defeat, were reimagined as temporary inconveniences. They were not framed as limits. They were framed as errors. The first steps beyond them were careful, measured, presented as reunification rather than aggression. He spoke of shared heritage, of people separated unnaturally, of historical wrongs that required peaceful correction. The words were chosen with restraint. The tone was reassuring. International response was cautious, concerned but hesitant. Memories of the last war remained vivid. No one wanted to believe that history was accelerating again. Inside Germany, confidence grew. not wild enthusiasm. Assurance. Assurance that momentum favored them. The leader's image shifted subtly. From restorer to visionary, he appeared tireless, always moving, always addressing crowds, but never revealing uncertainty. Success, when repeated early, creates dangerous feedback. It convinces systems that risk is manageable. It teaches followers that hesitation is unnecessary. Each advance was framed as defensive, necessary, overdue. The narrative insisted that Germany was not expanding. It was correcting alignment. The world responded with negotiation, with statements, with conferences that postponed decision. Postponement was interpreted as permission. Inside the leadership, confidence hardened. Caution was dismissed as weakness. Advice filtered upward selectively. Reality bent to expectation. The military, once constrained, found renewed purpose. Plans were refined, readiness emphasized. The language of inevitability entered command structures. The population adjusted quickly. Victory, even symbolic victory, is intoxicating. It offers proof that belief is justified. Crowds grew larger, rituals intensified, symbols multiplied. Expansion gave the ideology external confirmation. It no longer needed to argue, it demonstrated. Yet beneath the surface, a shift occurred. The movement no longer relied on grievance. It relied on success. Success changes expectations. It demands continuation. The promise of protection evolved. No longer protection from chaos, protection through dominance. Those who hesitated were accused not of disloyalty, but of pessimism. Pessimism threatened morale. Morale was framed as national security. The leader himself embraced the role fully now, less patient, more assured. The careful strategist gave way to the convinced architect. He believed the world would adjust, because so far it had. Expansion fed identity. Identity fed confidence. Confidence fed risk. Risk, when rewarded, feels like destiny. But destiny, mistaken for certainty, ignores friction. It overlooks resistance. It assumes compliance. And beyond the borders, the world was watching, uneasy, unsure, unprepared. The seduction of expansion lay not in ambition alone, but in confirmation. Each step forward whispered the same message. Nothing is stopping us. History was about to answer. Speed changes perception. What once required deliberation begins to feel instinctive. What once demanded justification starts to appear self-evident. Early successes had altered the internal rhythm of decision-making. Plans that would once have taken years now unfolded in months. Resistance that had been expected failed to materialize. Each unchallenged move trained the leadership to expect compliance. The international response remained hesitant. Statements were issued, concerns expressed, but action lagged. Diplomacy, designed to slow catastrophe, now accelerated it. Because delay was interpreted not as caution, but as incapacity. Inside Germany, the narrative hardened. The people were told that the world feared them, and fear was framed as respect. Respect, when mistaken for admiration, feeds arrogance. The leader's confidence deepened, not as theatrical bravado, but as private certainty. He had gambled repeatedly and won. From his perspective, history had confirmed his instincts. This confirmation mattered more than strategy. It reshaped how information was received. Advice that aligned with expectation was welcomed. Warnings that contradicted it were dismissed. The inner circle adjusted accordingly. No one wanted to be the voice of delay. In a climate that celebrated decisiveness, silence became safer than contradiction. Military planning reflected this shift. Speed was prioritized over sustainability, momentum over logistics. The assumption was simple. Opponents would react as others had. Slowly, reluctantly, ineffectively. This assumption was never rigorously tested. It did not need to be. Belief had replaced analysis. Public enthusiasm intensified. Not universal, but loud enough to dominate perception. Parades grew larger, symbols more omnipresent. Success demanded celebration. Celebration demanded continuation. The ideology adapted to this acceleration. It spoke less of grievance and more of destiny fulfilled. The language of correction gave way to the language of mission. Mission is a dangerous word. It implies exemption from doubt, from restraint, from reconsideration. As borders expanded, complexity followed. Administering new territories required compromise, coordination, and patience. These qualities were in short supply. Instead, simplification persisted. Local realities were flattened. Cultural differences ignored. The same assumptions were applied everywhere. Resistance appeared in small forms. Delays, confusion, quiet opposition. These signs were minimized, labeled temporary, irritating, but insignificant. Significance was measured by scale, and at scale, everything still appeared to move forward. The leader's relationship with time changed. Patience had once been strategic. Now it felt unnecessary. Why wait? When waiting had never improved outcomes, this impatience expressed itself subtly, in speeches that grew sharper, in directives that demanded immediacy, in a growing intolerance for complexity. Complexity slows action. Action was now synonymous with success. The machinery of expansion required constant motion. Stopping would invite scrutiny. Scrutiny would invite doubt. Doubt threatened the narrative, and so motion continued, faster, broader, more ambitious. Each success raised the stakes. What had once been daring now felt obligatory. What had once been optional now seemed inevitable. Inside the system, fear quietly shifted direction. Earlier, fear had been external, of chaos, of decline, of humiliation. Now fear became internal. Fear of hesitation, fear of questioning momentum, fear of appearing weak. Weakness was no longer tolerated, not publicly, not privately. The leader no longer needed persuasion. He needed affirmation, and affirmation, repeated often enough, creates isolation. Isolation narrows vision. It filters reality through expectation. It amplifies confidence, while muting contradiction. By the time warning signs became undeniable, they no longer sounded urgent. Urgency had been redefined as weakness. The seduction of expansion was complete. Success had rewritten the rules. Caution had become irrelevant. And somewhere beneath the speed and spectacle, a truth waited patiently. Momentum does not replace capacity, and belief does not eliminate resistance. The world was not empty. It was watching, and it was learning. Resistance did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive as a single event or a decisive confrontation. It emerged unevenly, in fragments, through hesitation that no longer dissolved, and obstacles that refused to move aside. For a time, the system mistook resistance for delay. Delays had always been manageable. They had been negotiated away, absorbed by pressure, or bypassed by speed. But this time, delay carried weight. Beyond the borders, governments began to coordinate, not decisively, not uniformly, but enough to alter the rhythm. Statements hardened, agreements tightened. What had once been confusion slowly reorganized into caution. Caution, unlike fear, does not retreat easily. The first signs appeared in logistics. Supply lines stretched. Administrative burdens multiplied. Territories that had seemed eager to comply revealed complexity. Language barriers. Local interests. Quiet defiance. These details did not fit the narrative, so they were ignored. Inside the leadership, impatience grew. Impatience does not tolerate nuance. It demands resolution, and resolution, when forced, creates friction. Military planning adjusted outwardly, while remaining unchanged inwardly. Speed was still prioritized. Decisiveness still celebrated. But the assumptions beneath these priorities were aging. The belief persisted. That resistance would collapse under pressure. That hesitation would fracture alliances. That opposition lacked will. These beliefs were no longer tested. They were repeated. Repetition hardens belief, but dulls perception. Public confidence remained high, but it had shifted tone. Early enthusiasm had been hopeful. Now it was expectant. Expectation demands results. Results became more difficult to deliver. Each new step required more force than the last. Force, once introduced, changes the nature of legitimacy. The ideology adapted again. It framed resistance as provocation, as proof that firmness was necessary, as evidence that hesitation had invited challenge. This logic closed the circle. Escalation justified itself. The leader's inner certainty intensified. He no longer interpreted events. He imposed meaning upon them. Contradictory information was dismissed as sabotage or misunderstanding. Isolation deepened, not physically, structurally. The system filtered input to preserve coherence. This filtration was subtle, not censorship in the obvious sense. Selection. What supported expectation rose upward. What complicated it fell away. Those who warned of overreach were marginalized, not punished dramatically, ignored. The belief in inevitability now required denial. Denial is labor. It consumes attention. It narrows vision. Outside Germany, the world adjusted. Alliances strengthened. Industries reoriented. Populations prepared. Not with enthusiasm, but with resolve. Resolve does not require confidence. It requires recognition. Recognition that survival may depend on endurance. The momentum that had once carried everything forward began to meet resistance that did not dissolve. It absorbed impact. It held. This was new. The system responded by accelerating further. Acceleration felt like control. Slowing felt like concession. The language sharpened. Speeches emphasized struggle. Sacrifice was reframed as honor. The future was portrayed as test. Tests implied judgment. Judgment requires winners and losers. The seduction of expansion had now fully transformed. It was no longer about correction or restoration. It was about proof. Proof that belief was justified. Proof that destiny had not misled them. Proof is a dangerous requirement because proof demands escalation. The machinery of power adjusted to this demand. Resources were redirected. Planning narrowed. Alternatives vanished. By the time the full weight of resistance became undeniable, options had already closed. Paths that once existed had been abandoned. Momentum, which had once felt like freedom, now became obligation. To stop would mean admitting error. Error threatened the narrative. The narrative sustained the system. And so movement continued, not because it was wise, because it was necessary to preserve belief. History does not collapse suddenly. It tightens. The seduction of expansion ended not with triumph, but with entanglement. The world had responded, not with panic, with preparation. And preparation, unlike fear, does not fade. Collapse rarely begins with defeat. It begins with fatigue. What had once been framed as movement now felt like burden. The early rhythm of expansion, fast, confident, intoxicating, slowed into something heavier. Decisions required more effort. Outcomes demanded more sacrifice. Victory no longer arrived quickly enough to sustain belief. The war had changed its nature. It was no longer defined by motion. It was defined by endurance. Inside Germany, daily life adjusted again, not dramatically. Gradually, routines tightened. Expectations narrowed. What had once been promised as temporary settled into permanence. Resources grew scarce, not immediately absent. Strained, shortages were managed, rationing normalized. The language of necessity replaced the language of triumph. Necessity reframes morality. What would once have seemed unacceptable becomes reasonable. When framed as survival, the system demanded focus. Total focus. Dissent was no longer merely inconvenient. It was framed as threat. The leader's world shrank, physically, into offices, maps, reports, psychologically, into a narrowing range of acceptable outcomes. He relied increasingly on abstractions, arrows on maps, numbers on charts. Reality arrived, mediated, filtered, adjusted. Reports were shaped to preserve coherence. Bad news was softened. Contradictions minimized. Not always by command, often by anticipation. Anticipation is more dangerous than censorship. It teaches subordinates to edit themselves. As the war lengthened, the assumption of inevitability weakened, but it did not disappear. It transformed. Inevitability became insistence. Insistence demanded proof. Proof demanded sacrifice. Sacrifice, once introduced, changes the logic of decision-making. When too much has been invested, retreat feels impossible. The leader responded by tightening control, not outwardly at first. Internally, decision-making centralized further, consultation narrowed, confidence became a requirement. He did not seek advice. He sought confirmation. Isolation deepened. Those closest to him mirrored his certainty, not because they believed without doubt, but because doubt had become dangerous. Danger reshapes loyalty. Loyalty becomes performance. Performance replaces truth. The war on the ground grew more complex. Multiple fronts, conflicting demands. Each demanded priority. None could be abandoned without threatening the narrative. The narrative, by now, was everything. Public communication shifted again. The tone grew harder. Speeches emphasized endurance. Victory was framed not as near, but as inevitable, despite evidence to the contrary. This contradiction strained credibility, but credibility was no longer the goal. Control was. The population adapted. Adaptation does not require belief. It requires calculation. People learned what to say, what not to say, how to survive quietly. Fear no longer unified. It isolated. The leader's inner world reflected this change. Earlier, confidence had been expansive. Now it was defensive. Every setback felt personal. Every delay felt like betrayal. He interpreted events less as consequence and more as interference. Interference implied intention. Intention required enemies. Enemies multiplied in abstraction as reality resisted simplification. The system tightened further. Commands grew more absolute. Flexibility disappeared. Flexibility is incompatible with belief in destiny. Destiny demands obedience. As the war dragged on, the cost of certainty became visible. Not immediately to all, but undeniably. Cities bore marks of strain. Infrastructure wore thin. The spectacle of order faded. What remained was function. Function without faith feels mechanical. The leader, once energized by crowds, now appeared removed from them. Distance increased. Symbolically, emotionally, he no longer needed adoration. He needed control. And control, once absolute, creates fragility, because systems built on certainty cannot adapt. The collapse had begun, not with surrender, with rigidity. Isolation rarely announces itself. It does not arrive as loneliness. It arrives as control. As the war expanded and tightened around Germany, the leader's physical world contracted. Meetings became fewer, rooms became smaller, windows mattered less than maps. The outside world reached him, filtered through layers of reassurance. Information no longer traveled freely. It traveled selectively. Reports were condensed, language softened, failures rephrased. Not because deception was ordered, but because it was expected. Expectation is powerful. It teaches silence. Those who brought bad news learned quickly which details to omit, which uncertainties to resolve prematurely, which possibilities to discard. The system rewarded alignment, not accuracy. Gradually, reality bent, not all at once, in increments small enough to escape confrontation. The leader trusted the system he had built. He trusted it because it reflected him. Certainty echoed certainty. As fronts multiplied, strategic complexity intensified. But complexity no longer had a place. The world was still interpreted through binary categories: advance or betrayal, victory or sabotage. This narrowing of interpretation made adaptation impossible. Decisions were issued with increasing rigidity. Orders became more detailed, less flexible. Commanders on the ground found themselves constrained by directives, detached from conditions. When plans failed, the explanation was never structural. It was personal. Someone had lacked will, someone had disobeyed, someone had misunderstood. Responsibility climbed upward in rhetoric, but downward in consequence. The leader's language changed. Earlier speeches had been expansive, filled with imagery and promise. Now they were compressed, sharper, more accusatory. He no longer spoke to inspire. He spoke to demand. Demand does not invite correction. It suppresses it. Within the inner circle, agreement became ritual. Questions felt dangerous. Silence felt prudent. Even conviction, when expressed, was carefully calibrated. This created a paradox. The leader appeared surrounded by loyalty, but loyalty had lost substance. It had become performance. Performance sustains illusion. Illusion sustains belief. Belief sustains control. But control without reality creates brittleness. The war on the ground continued to evolve. Opposition adapted. Resources were mobilized efficiently. Resistance hardened. These developments reached the center slowly and incompletely. Each delay preserved coherence at the cost of accuracy. As losses mounted, the leader interpreted them not as consequence of overreach, but as evidence of insufficient resolve. Resolve became the solution to every problem. If resolve was absolute, victory was assured. This belief was no longer strategic. It was existential. The leader's personal routines reflected this shift. He slept irregularly. Meals became mechanical. His world revolved around briefings and directives. Human presence diminished. People became functions. Names replaced by roles. Roles replaced by symbols. The earlier fascination with spectacle disappeared. No parades, no large gatherings. They were unnecessary. Control had moved inward. Inward control is quieter, but it is also more fragile because it depends entirely on the coherence of belief. Any contradiction now threatened collapse. So contradictions were denied. As denial deepened, decisions grew harsher, not because cruelty was the goal, but because certainty demanded reinforcement. Reinforcement requires escalation. Escalation demands sacrifice. Sacrifice, once demanded, cannot be reversed without confession. Confession threatens the entire structure. And so, the system chose persistence. Even as conditions worsened, even as options narrowed, the leader no longer reacted to events. He imposed expectation upon them. Expectation replaced observation. This is the final stage of isolation, not absence of information, domination of interpretation. The collapse was no longer theoretical, it was embedded in decisions that could not adapt, in systems that could not correct, in a mind that could not doubt. The war would continue, but its outcome was no longer shaped by strategy or strength. It was shaped by rigidity, and rigidity, once absolute, breaks. The end did not arrive as clarity. There was no sudden understanding, no moment of recognition in which error revealed itself and demanded correction. What arrived instead was compression. The world narrowed geographically as territory contracted and movement became constrained strategically as options disappeared one by one. Psychologically, as interpretation hardened into insistence, maps grew smaller, arrows shortened. What had once been sweeping gestures of certainty became defensive calculations. But the language did not adjust. The language never adjusts when belief must be preserved. Inside the shrinking circle of command, the same assumptions repeated themselves. Victory was still inevitable. Resistance was still temporary. Resolve would still prevail. These statements no longer described reality. They defended identity. Identity, when threatened, does not surrender quietly. It resists evidence. As conditions worsened, the system demanded greater sacrifices. Sacrifice became proof of commitment. Commitment became substitute for strategy. The population endured. Endurance is not endorsement, but endurance was interpreted as loyalty. Loyalty reinforced belief. The leader's isolation reached its final form, not physical isolation, but conceptual. He no longer needed confirmation. He required compliance. Compliance arrived in ritual. Meetings followed patterns. Briefings used familiar language. New information was absorbed only if it fit existing frames. This was not denial in the dramatic sense. It was maintenance. Maintenance of coherence in a system that could no longer adapt. The outside world pressed inward. Opposition tightened. Resources dwindled. Time accelerated. Acceleration intensifies distortion. There is no space for reconsideration, only reaction. Reaction replaced deliberation. Orders were issued with absolute certainty and diminishing relevance. Reality no longer mattered. Execution mattered. The leader's personal presence diminished further. He appeared less often, spoke less freely. Interaction narrowed to command. Human complexity vanished entirely. People became variables. Variables became obstacles. Obstacles demanded removal. The logic was complete, perfectly consistent, entirely detached. When collapse finally arrived, it was not dramatic, it was procedural. Systems ceased to function. Communication faltered. Coordination failed. The mechanisms that had once delivered efficiency now amplified dysfunction. There was no final speech. That resolved contradiction. No acknowledgement of misjudgment. No reconciliation with consequence. The end came quietly, underground, separated from the world that had once mirrored belief. The individual at the center of the system did not change at the end. This matters. There was no transformation, no acceptance, no expansion of understanding. What ended was not conviction, it was capacity. The system he had built collapsed, not because belief weakened, but because belief had replaced flexibility. History moved on, not because it had been corrected, but because it had exhausted itself. What remained was damage, structural, human, moral. The collapse from within had never required revelation. It required only persistence. Persistence without reflection is not strength. It is inertia. And inertia, when it collides with reality, does not negotiate. It breaks. What remains after collapse is rarely silence. It is residue, not the residue of buildings alone, or borders redrawn, or documents archived, but the residue of habits, ways of thinking that once felt necessary, ways of obeying that once felt safe, ways of simplifying that once felt merciful. History is often taught as sequence. This happened, then this, then it ended. But history does not live in sequence. It lives in repetition. The system that collapsed did not invent its tools. It refined them. Certainty, for example, did not originate there. It had existed long before. In households where authority replaced dialogue, in institutions where order was valued above truth, in cultures where belonging mattered more than understanding, fear did not begin with propaganda. Fear existed already. In economic insecurity, in social dislocation, in the quiet erosion of meaning. The system did not create fear, it organized it. This distinction matters because organization is more dangerous than chaos. Chaos is visible. Organization feels responsible. What remains, then, is not a villain frozen in time. It is a method. The method begins with simplification. Complex problems are reframed as moral failures. Structural uncertainty is translated into personal blame. Ambiguity is declared weakness. This method rewards clarity over accuracy. Clarity feels comforting. Accuracy demands effort. The method continues with identity, not identity as lived experience, but identity as boundary. Who belongs? Who does not? Boundaries create cohesion. Cohesion creates discipline. Discipline, once admired, easily becomes obedience. The method then embeds itself in systems, not through force at first, but through procedure, rules adjusted, responsibilities centralized. Legality becomes shield. At this stage, resistance feels impolite, excessive, alarmist. The method survives because it distributes responsibility. No single action appears catastrophic. Each step feels incremental, reasonable. By the time consequence becomes visible, the path backward has disappeared. What remains is participation, not universal, not enthusiastic, but sufficient. Participation does not require belief. It requires adaptation. Adaptation becomes habit. Habit becomes normality. And normality, once established, no longer feels dangerous. The leader at the center of this story was not unique in temperament. History does not depend on uniqueness. It depends on alignment. Alignment between fear and certainty, between grievance and identity, between obedience and relief. When these align, systems accelerate. The collapse that followed did not disprove the ideology. It exhausted it. This, too, matters, because exhaustion invites forgetting. Forgetting is tempting. It offers distance without responsibility. It allows memory to soften, but softened memory loses warning. What remains, then, is the question of attention. Not what happened, but how it was allowed to feel normal. The past does not ask to be relived. It asks to be recognized. Recognized in language that simplifies suffering. Recognized in systems that promise protection without accountability. Recognized in voices that speak with absolute certainty. During moments of uncertainty, the danger is not loud, it is efficient. It does not announce cruelty, it announces order. It does not demand devotion, it offers relief, and relief when paired with fear, can justify almost anything. What remains is the responsibility of complexity, to resist simplification, to tolerate ambiguity, to question certainty, especially when certainty feels comforting. This is not a lesson limited to one time or place. It repeats. Whenever exhaustion meets explanation, history does not warn us. By shouting, it whispers through pattern, and the pattern remains.